blue light exposure after sundown and low sleep, how does that relate to testosterone?
Yeah, it significantly impairs testosterone. I mean, in my own testing, I have seen a swing of like 300 to 400 points based on how good my sleep has been. So if I've had, say, for example, like normally mine's around like 800, and if I have, say, 3 nights of short or highly interrupted sleep, I could test for as low as 500, which is significant. And I think the number that they use is somewhere around like around 400, 500. It's really hard to be fertile as a man. And I don't know if you saw that. It was kind of funny. The guys that do This American Life on NPR, they kind of like, they went through this testosterone thing. I just had to chuckle because like they were, oh, what is this, right? And they were both under 200.
Yeah.
Under 200. Now I don't know what their age is, but I also know a guy in his 60s whose total testosterone is 950.
Yeah, I know.
And he's
guy in his 50s or 60s over 1,000. No, mine. But it begs the question, because some people can't go test testosterone all the time.
Yeah.
But we can equate it with grip strength. It's a good one.
Grip strength's a good one. Well, there's a few like pretty overt things, that you will give you.
And you could see then real time, like, oh, I didn't sleep well. What is my grip strength? You could then just kind of do your own N of 1 study.
Yeah.
You see how on one day your grip strength will change based on your sleep.
Is that short term, where if your testosterone is good from just that single day? I would imagine it's a durational thing, because it would affect muscle strength.
Yeah, it definitely affects muscle strength. And it does cycle through the day, and it's pretty variable. Like you could test every single morning, let's say 8 a.m., what your total testosterone is. There was a period where I was testing like once every 2 weeks for like a couple months, and I would see fluctuations of like 100 to 200 points. And
so it might change day to day based on sleep.
Yeah, well, it definitely does. Yeah, it definitely does. In fact, that's the biggest thing. Like, having tested a variety of different herbs, things to assist the liver clearing estrogen, things that are aromatase inhibitors, like natural aromatase inhibitors, or things that decrease sex hormone binding globulin, which prevents the free testosterone from circulating. All of these things, the biggest impact has been maximizing sleep quality and duration. So by far, Paul Saladino was just talking to somebody recently about this too, and essentially said the same thing. It's like dietary and sleep are the two biggest, those are your biggest ROIs to focus on pretty much with everything, and that is the starting point for everything.
Mental balance, right?
Right, everything.
Cognitive.
Right.
Yeah, it's right there. You got to get that sleep down.
So with kids, how do you ensure the diet and the sleep is optimized? Because it's obviously a lot of people use that as a valid excuse.
Yeah. Yeah. I have 3 young kids, just so people know. Well, optimal is relative, right? Like my optimal is going to be different, and my context can be different than yours. You can control a lot more things in your environment than I can control. Like last night, my son woke up at like, 3 in the morning and woke me up, and it took him 10 minutes to get back to sleep. And that was like kind of a struggle, and my cortisol went up a little bit. So it took me longer to get back to sleep. And that happened 3 nights in a row. And so like that, definitely I feel that. But like in your context, you could choose not to be drinking 3 nights in a row, and that's not going to screw up your sleep. You know what I mean? Or you could choose to go to sleep at 9 instead of 11, which I personally find gets me a better quality night's sleep. Or you could choose not to eat a huge meal before going to sleep, so you don't have to use resources to digest your food. You can use that for your brain to go through sleep cycling. So there are things that you can't. So like I do all that, right? I do those things, but I can't control like necessarily the chaos of my household and how that's going to affect my stress hormones and then how that's going to affect my sleep. But I can make the food choices for my family.
Meal timing is that big one.
I think meal timing is really big.
A big one. That people don't fully understand how that those with Oura rings can check this out themselves. How your HRV will change and your respiratory rates and your CO2 levels, even though they don't really do a great job of that. But if you stop eating a couple hours before bed, it was in the master's program, I did a little study on just myself, because I was using the Oura ring and saying, oh, how good was my sleep when I stopped eating at least 2-3 hours before going to bed. And then how did I feel the next day? And it was like, oh, when I stopped to actually evaluate this and then looked at the objective data as well, it was night and day. And it really kept me on this track, like, oh, you do need to stop, because we need an incentive to stop feeding the pie hole at a certain hour. Right? And if we can see this affects our performance, our mental well-being, how we affect others the next day, our strength, all these things, as we said, sleep is key, then it gives us more inspiration, incentive to stop that, a few hours ahead of time before bed.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into good sleep, and you mentioned a really important one, which is blue light and making sure you're not getting overexposed after the sun goes down.
Getting exercise in the morning.
That's a great one. Not eating a big meal right before sleep. But one thing that I recently did that had a pretty big impact on my sleep also was meal timing and making sure that I was eating 4 regular meals throughout the day, 4 for me, and including enough carbohydrates in those meals. And why this matters is so cortisol, which everybody probably understands is a stress hormone, is a necessary hormone, but it's usually not following a good pattern for most people. It's either too high or too low. And its main role in the body is to regulate blood sugar. That's its primary job. And so if a person's not getting enough carbohydrates relative to their need, your body's gonna require glucose from somewhere. And so what it's gonna do is going to release cortisol to initiate the process of breaking down your muscle tissue to make glucose. And so if you're eating a low carb diet and you're probably experiencing sleep disruptions or waking at 3 a.m. as a result of not having enough carbohydrate because of this dynamic. And that was not clear to me. And I was not intentionally on a low carb diet, but I was just kind of focusing on good quality fats for a long time. And my fat to carbohydrate ratios were a little bit skewed because of that. And I have, not every night, but I would say 2-3 nights out of the week, I would wake up and I'm usually waking up hungry. And so what that is the cortisol is trying to rebalance your blood sugar. Now you're awake, and you're awake until that metabolizes. And so making sure you're getting enough carbohydrates regularly, not a bolus at one time, but you're spreading that throughout the day is a good way to, because what happens with that carbohydrate is it gets, a lot of it gets stored as glycogen in your liver. And your liver is the power source for your brain at night while you're sleeping. And so that glycogen breaks down into glucose to feed the neurons of your brain to run the sleep cycling. And so it needs energy to do that. And it's the mitochondria and the neurons that are doing that process, and they like glucose. And so that had a really big impact on my sleep.
So with that in mind, maybe not a big meal before you go to bed, but having honey, having an apple, something with some sugar, dates, a little bit, just to keep that sleep cycle in place through the night so you can get the 7-8 hours that we need. So a little snack like that doesn't have that HRV impact in the Oura ring that you were talking about, but eating a meal does. Right.
And so the easier it is to digest those carbohydrates, the less of an impact it's going to have on that that sleep performance.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you said, honey's a great food because it's really easy to digest. Honey with a little salt in it, right, is another good one. Sometimes if my kids are super wound up, I'll just do like a little milk and honey, so they have the fat to kind of buffer the uptake of the glucose over time. But 2 dates, like those kinds of things are great. Yeah.
So what's the deal with cortisol? Because obviously we're all scared of it. We think it's the worst thing ever. But you're saying it's necessary. So what are the levels we should be getting?
Yeah.
Looking at?
Yeah. Well, an easy way to know this is to test for it, and probably the cheapest test to do is just a salivary cortisol test, where you test your saliva 4 times throughout the day, and you want to see it cycling. It has a circadian rhythm, and so it essentially peaks in the morning and then slowly declines until it peaks the next morning. You can see all kinds of patterns. You can see, somebody who's like busy all the time is probably at an elevated cortisol pattern throughout the day.
High beta.
And so,
high beta in the mind.
Yeah, right. In terms of brain frequencies. Yeah.
It's stress. It's really, it's a stress on the system. So it's really an aging thing, right?
Yeah.
Cortisol is the big stress. It's what ages us, if it's imbalanced.
Yeah, it's a great way to look at cortisol is an aging hormone.
Aging hormone, yeah. But it is a necessary. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. So it's beautiful in that, hey, it gets us motivated to move, to start going, to move into action, through the day. But once we're there, we can that momentum's going. We can kind of roll with it on our own. We don't need to stay in that high stress cortisol state.
Right. Yeah.
We're into anti-aging.
Yeah. And then there's another pattern that you may see is someone who's just kind of flatlined cortisol. It's not following a circadian rhythm, and your alternative naturopaths used to call that adrenal fatigue, and so this is like just a severely depleted system. Somebody that was previously elevated in cortisol, but for a long period of time, and then the body just down regulated that cortisol production because it was so catabolic. So you end up there. And then another pattern that you can see is an inverted cortisol rhythm, and this is what people like to term night owl as a euphemism for dysregulated circadian rhythm. It's a euphemism for a
if we were testing someone who was a night owl, got their kickstart at 12 midnight, it would likely be that their cortisol is up there at 12 midnight, and it's usually no bueno.
No, yeah, that's not good. That's not good for many reasons. And it's funny, like the whole night owl thing was there was an attempt to connect that term and that sort of lifestyle to chronotyping. But when you look at the chronotyping data, the fluctuation is like 2 hours.
It's only an hour, right? It's an hour or two.
Right. It's like the early bird is let's say there's a phenotype for this or a genetic reason for this. The early bird really is only going to rise 2 hours earlier than somewhat we'll call it an ancestral night owl, right? So like that's the difference between
5 in the morning versus 7 in the
exactly, or going to sleep.
Someone that goes to bed at 2 and wakes up at 9 or 10.
Exactly. Yeah. And they would be like 9 p.m. going to sleep versus 11 p.m. going to sleep.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know how we got there, but
but it's a good topic, right? Because people think, oh, I'm just meant to be a night owl, and it's okay to be a night owl, but not overdo it, not be a midnight owl, right? And so, again, it's all what you value, and if your creative forces, juices come alive at those hours, and that's what you value because that's your work. You just have to recognize that that's a decision, that it may affect your health. So maybe it's something that you don't want to do all the time, that it may have its effect on your overall well-being long term. So again, it's a decision. But It's good to have this knowledge so that you can tweak it a little bit, possibly.
Yeah. I think it's also worth noting that the World Health Organization has listed night shift work as a carcinogen.
Yeah.
and that's because of what all these mechanisms that we're talking about. So like, yeah, maybe you have a short-term purpose for being a night owl because, I don't know, you got to stay up all night to do your art, to finish a project, and that's the only time you can do it. But as a lifestyle, it's carcinogenic.
Yeah.
So, you know, right.
Hey, if one doesn't care, fine.
Yeah.
You know, it's where you care. But we're speaking mostly to people that do care. So
Yeah.
So that's good. And yeah, anything else for this? But Morgan, anything out of you?
I want to ask how, you know, we all know you can physiologically control cortisol. What about psychologically? Because Mark's really into meditation. He speaks a lot about emotional regulation from it. So
Yeah.
it's something you believe in a lot.
Yeah. Well, Mark's an expert in this, so I don't have a whole lot to add. I don't know how much you've spoken about this on your channel yet, but
then I mean, we've probably spoken how, you know, bringing you can have an effect on your cortisol through your mind, right? Through a process of being at ease with the world, how it unfolds, right? And so that you are not triggered as much, which is stressing, which is creating cortisol. If you are triggered all the time, you can bet that your cortisol is up quite a bit. And so the process of meditation, or a spiritual process of prayer meditation, that kind of evens out this mental chatter, which doesn't trigger you as much, is going to have a fairly profound effect on your stress and cortisol levels. And so I don't know if studies have been done on that, but I would suspect that, you know, the guys in Missouri, the Transcendental Meditation, who've done the most studies on this, have, you know, that if we were to look up that, I mean, John Kabat-Zinn was like big into stress mindfulness through stress reduction through mindfulness. And so this has been studied for over 30, 40 years of how this does reduce stress and hence reducing cortisol.
Yeah.
So
I don't have like much to add, but I'm just laughing as I came in, and you guys are talking about this in such scientific terms when at one point it was just natural and everything was just, it was organic, and now we have to convince people with science.
Yeah, so Morgan's suggesting, because we can't hear you over there, is Morgan suggesting that, at one point we think that this was natural, that back in the day, that our ancestral ways were natural. I mean,
that we have to convince people otherwise now.
Now, well, because science has brought us around to a lot of other things in our world, that blue light and, other responsibilities that have us kind of out of our norm.
There was no other way we lived, Now as we got into cities with technology, we've just strayed.
Yeah, we have a phone or pad in front of us all the time, so.
But now there's just a category of us who understand it, rather than.
Oh, you mean
like this is a club, right? This is like its own thing versus people who, or can't,
We want more people in the club understanding these things, that start to care, because then you start to wake up to what's going on in the world. It's one way to wake up to it anyway. Good point. Yeah. Morgan, Jonathan was talking earlier, we can be off camera on this one, about the impact of implants, of birth control, and how it makes one less attractive to the other sex.
It makes you like beta male.
Through pheromones.
Jump into that again. Yeah.
What's that?
Tell her about that again.
Yeah. What I didn't mention is that the most common birth control now is progestin, and they call it a progesterone mimic, but it's not actually progesterone. It actually has more estrogenic and androgenic functions than it does progesterone type functions.
I asked my OBGYN and their system, a couple of doctors who were in the room, and I asked, did you change the formula, or did someone change the formula, because this is very different than the first time.
Maybe you want to
You know, the whole birth control thing is really crazy because there's another effect that it has, and I think a probably more pernicious effect is that so one of the things that it does is significantly increases estrogen in the body, and estrogen, you know, has a number of when it's elevated, has a number of creates a number of problems. But probably one of the biggest problems is that it burdens the liver, because the liver is responsible for detoxifying it. The liver also is responsible for converting thyroid hormone from its storage form into its active form. And about 80% of that occurs in the liver. And it's my thought is that it is the early birth control that is making women hypothyroid, because of the amount of estrogen that it is increasing. I personally know a gal who is 30, and her TSH was like 300. So to give you an idea, you know, a doctor would consider 4 is elevated, or 4.5. When I tested mine was 1.6. Ray Pete thought that it should be below 1. And she had been on birth control for 10, 15 years. And when she went off of it, couldn't get her cycle back after 1 year. She couldn't actually run through a proper cycle because the estrogen was still way too high. And so this all of this stuff affects one another, and estrogen is a really big problem. So why is hypothyroidism a problem in the first place? Well, you have the symptoms of hypothyroid, which are like feeling cold, hair falling out, brittle hair, brittle nails, digestive problems, lethargy. Usually there's some sort of sexual dysfunction that's involved in there. And the reason you have so many widespread symptoms is because it slows down energy production. So it makes a person low power. Okay, so then your body has to sort of triage where this limited power supply goes, and it shuts down fertility, because that's a luxury when you're trying to survive. And so this birth control thing is a big problem for energy production, especially in women. And this is also why women generally are more hypothyroid than men, even without the birth control, because they have higher amounts of estrogen than men do. So even though I think the vast majority of people are at some level hypothyroid, generally speaking, women are more than men are because of the estrogen issue. And the easy way to test for that, rather than just go get your blood work, is probably the more accurate way anyway, is to test your body temperature. Your body temperature is the best measure, because body heat is a natural product of mitochondrial function. And if your mitochondria are working well, and the mitochondria and the thyroid system are like talking to each other and working together to regulate metabolism, if you are waking up at 98 degrees Fahrenheit and then it's rising to 98.6 after you've eaten your first meal, then you're doing well. But very few people experience that nowadays. And my personal experience before I started trying to optimize for that was waking up at 97.2. That's not dramatically bad, but moving the needle for myself from 97.2 to 98 had a big impact on all, like everything just got better, because there was more energy in the system. And, going back to the lady I was referring to, whose TSH was over 300, her waking body temperature is like 95 degrees. It's gotten so bad that even in medical school, they're talking about changing the normal average body temperature because so many people are lower body temp. It's like 1.5 degrees lower than it was 80 to 100 years ago. And this is a representation of metabolism of mitochondrial function. And estrogen is a big contributor to that slowing.
They have, I don't know if you know more about individual birth controls, but they have like different kinds, which is progesterone, estrogen, androgenic, and I guess a new simulated or mockery of it. But I'm just wondering if they all basically would do the same thing in the end.
I don't know enough about it. You know,
I did as much research as possible before even getting it in, and then I came to the page after I got it out how diminishing it was for my body. So.
Yeah, it's
I've had a lot of issues.
Any women have your age, so it's
Every friend I know who's gotten off birth control has had very similar issues with me, and now we're just going back to giving more money to doctors who can fix our other issues, just like everything else.
Give your money to him instead.
I'll give my money to you.
Well, the easiest way, probably the most direct way to get back to regular cycling is taking progesterone at the right time and taking some type of thyroid therapy.
Thyroid.
Both of those things together would significantly help.
What would you suggest with thyroid?
Well,
Had an issue, so.
in a natural form, the natural desiccated thyroid from like a clean grass-fed cow, where they basically just grind up and freeze dry the thyroid gland. You take it as a capsule. That may be enough, but depending on the burden of the liver and how inhibited that conversion process is I was talking about, like a solo T3 therapy might be the way to do it at the beginning and then transition. This like introducing thyroid is a multi-step process. It needs to be monitored by symptoms and also by body temperature, and you're adjusting as things get improved. Does that make sense? And so that in like an individual T3 therapy would have to be something that, well, people in the space I work in usually get it from like either like a research grade facility so that there's no script involved. You can, like, from these peptide companies, a lot of them will sell like T3 solo as research purposes, or you order it from like some online Mexican pharmacy and they'll ship it to you. So that's the way to get T3 only. There's no, to my knowledge, there's no natural extract from the thyroid gland itself. So these T3 therapies I'm talking about are synthetic, but they work. And if you're trying to get back to regular cycling or you're trying to get fertile, that's a really powerful way to do it. And then when you take the progesterone, it has to be, its specific form. It has to be mixed with vitamin E. It needs to be rubbed into your gums, not a patch, not a cream, not transdermal in any way. And it has to be in the second 2 weeks of the cycle. And like a person can tolerate, a pretty high amount of that. So it doesn't have any negative feedback either. It actually stimulates endogenous progesterone production rather than having the negative inhibition that, say, testosterone would. But yeah, that's what I would do.
Yeah.
And then once that happens, then you can sort of measure your body temperature fluctuation to determine ovulation. So now you have your cycle back and you can determine when you're fertile, and that can help inform,
Yeah, everything. What needs to be important.
Yes, exactly.
Good to know. That is. I did do a topical progesterone, but I don't really think
Well, you're saying there's a lot more to it, right?
As I'm saying,
The jumps and,
did something.
but T3, finding a source of T3 through